You ever watch cop shows, police detective dramas? If you have, you've probably seen somebody being interrogated. And sometimes you'll see when the detectives interrogate a suspect, they'll employ the good cop, bad cop method. You know what I'm talking about? If you're unfamiliar with this, it's where one officer plays the role of bad cop, behaving in a menacing way and threatening the suspect with what will happen if they don't confess. The good cop will then come into the room and be more friendly and calm, reassuring the suspect that he's on the suspect's side and that everything's going to be okay if they'll just help them to discover the truth. I was watching the Lego movie with Will Gray the other day, and I noticed that there's a character in the Lego movie called Bad Cop, Good Cop, and he plays both of those roles at the same time. His face is scowling and his voice is gruff as Bad Cop, but then his head spins around and it reveals a smiling face and a friendly demeanor as Good Cop. And of course, because I'm a minister and everything I see is a sermon illustration, I said, hey, that's sort of like the prophets. And Will Gray was like, what? And then realizing I said that out loud and not just in my head. So, oh, no, just watch the movie. But Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, is actually a pretty good example of this good cop, bad cop in one person thing. See, bad cop Isaiah begins with judgment, saying in chapter 1 of his book that Israel is a sinful nation, a people laden with iniquity who have forsaken the Lord and who have despised the Holy One of Israel. He goes on to say that the anger of the Lord was kindled against his people and he stretched out his hand against them. But then good cop Isaiah shows up and speaks with a reassuring voice, and in chapter 40 we hear, "Comfort, O comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her that she has served her term, that her penalty is paid." As a matter of fact, some of those hope-filled verses from Isaiah are ones that we read during Advent and at Christmas as we prepare for the birth of Christ. Similar to Isaiah, there's bad cop Ezekiel. He speaks for God, saying, "Now the end is upon you. I will let loose my anger upon you. I will judge you according to your ways. I will punish you for all your abominations." But then later in chapter 37 of Ezekiel, which we talked about 2 weeks ago, you might remember, good cop Ezekiel shares a vision of the valley of dried bones being brought back to life, a vision in which God assures Israel that they do have a future. Bad cop, good cop. The prophets speak the harsh truth that the sins of Israel have left them estranged from God, and that their breaking covenant with God will lead to the great gift of the promised land being taken away from them. But the prophets usually follow up that comforting, or that word of judgment with a comforting word, a promise that God's love, as the psalmist writes, is from everlasting to everlasting, that God will not forget God's people, and that one day God will relent from punishing and restore Israel to right relationship with God. For all their dire predictions, the prophets usually end on a note of hope. Usually, but not always. Like the other prophets that we've read, Amos begins by outlining where the Israelites have broken their covenant with God. But as we keep reading, expecting the bad cop to step out for a cup of coffee and the comforting, reassuring good cop to enter the room, she never does. For 9 chapters, Amos pounds away at his audience, and in the end gives precious little to us in the way of hope. The sins of Israel are great, and God will act to allow their destruction at the hands of the Assyrians. This is the word of Amos. No reassurance of the reestablishment of Israel, no words of comfort for those to be taken away into exile, only a proclamation that the people have turned from God and will now experience the consequences of their actions. Now, that's part of the reason why we don't usually read Amos in church very much. We like reassurance. We like comfort. We like words of hope. And while Amos is long on judgment and dire consequences, he is woefully short on reassurance, comfort, and hope. Amos calls out the Israelites for what they've done and for what they've left undone. But he doesn't really allow his readers to move past that to God's mercy. He leaves them there in the midst of God's wrath and lets them think about it. For that reason alone, Amos can be difficult to read. But as much as we'd like to just skip over it, we can't. We have to try to understand all the parts of the Bible, even the difficult ones, and to learn from them. Now, the first thing we have to understand about Amos is that he's talking about Israel. Amos isn't really talking about 21st century America. He's addressing very real problems in his own time. Sometimes we want to read the prophets as though they were written as a warning to us, as though 3,000 years ago they were thinking about the 21st century United States. But Amos had no thought of modern America, and it's kind of arrogant to think that he did. Amos was delivering a message from God to the people of the northern kingdom of Israel, period. But we may find it instructive to read and to study his words in their appropriate context so that we can understand what the Israelites did wrong, and then we can learn from their mistakes. Now, the passage we read this morning was the core of Amos's criticism of Israel. God is not pleased, to put it lightly, with the people's worship because their sins make it impossible for God to take their worship seriously. Old Testament scholar James Newsom writes that the failures of the people were basically these three things. The northern kingdom had responded to God's blessing with shallow and perfunctory worship. They had used Israel's prosperity to purchase laziness and indolence. And they gained prosperity, in part at least, by dishonesty and fraud and by oppression of the poor and the needy. Now, many folks, including Amos himself, would likely see the wealth and power of the northern kingdom at that time as a sign of God's blessing. But where the people should have been dedicating themselves to worship as a means of giving thanks to God, scholar James Limburg tells us that religion had become a matter of solemn gatherings, sumptuous feasts, sacrifices, and singing, but nothing more. The soul had gone out of it. There was no communion with the Holy One. There was only a commotion at the holy place. And so God says, through the prophet Amos, I despise your festivals. The use of two words to describe a negative emotion emphasizes the depth of God's displeasure. I take no delight in your solemn assemblies, God says. Literally, the Hebrew here translates to, what you're doing smells bad. It'd be like trying to eat a gourmet dinner in the middle of a sewer. It might still taste good and be exquisitely prepared, but the taste is going to be overwhelmed by the odor of all the other stuff around you. Now, the worship of the people may on some level have been genuine, but God cannot appreciate it because of the overwhelming funk generated by the people's actions the rest of the time. In all, Amos mentions 7 acts of worship that are detestable to God. There are festivals, solemn assemblies, burnt offerings, grain offerings, offerings of fatted animals, songs, and the music of harps. 7 being the number of completeness in the Old Testament, we can reasonably infer that God is here expressing disdain for all of Israel's worship. And why is that? Because their intentional acts of worship to God are completely overwhelmed by the lives that they lead every day. The bottom line is that the people may be worshiping God, but they're not doing justice. They've gained their wealth and power in part by dishonesty and fraud, and on the backs of the poor and the defenseless. We see this accusation clearly in chapter 8, where the contemporary English version's translation captures the depth of what Amos is saying. He says, "You people crush those in need and wipe out the poor. You say to yourselves, how much longer before the end of the new moon festival? When will the Sabbath be over? Our wheat is ready, and we want to sell it now. We can't wait to cheat and charge high prices for the grain we sell. We will use dishonest scales and mix dust in with the grain. Those who are needy and poor don't have any money. We will make them our slaves for the price of a pair of sandals." And by the wealth and power that they have gained, they have sought not what will be best for all of God's children. They have merely made life better for themselves. Again, the prophet writes, "You rich people lounge around on beds with ivory posts while dining on the meat of your lambs and calves. You sing foolish songs to the music of harps, and you make up new tunes just as David used to do. You drink all the wine you want and wear expensive perfume, but you don't care about the ruin of your nation. So you will be the first to be dragged off as captives. Your good times will end." Last week, Mary talked about the prophet Micah and how he taught that the people's lives should be living acts of worship, that everything they do should reflect an awareness of God's presence and an appreciation of God's goodness. What the Israelites have done is to go through the motions of worship during the appointed times for worship, while living the rest of their days as if the covenant with God had never happened, as if God did not exist. You can look at it this way. How many of you would say that you know that your parents love you or loved you? Show of hands. Okay. How do you know? If you were in a court of law and you were asked to present evidence that your parents loved you, what would you say? My hunch is that most of us would point to the fact that they were always there for us, that they always showed up for our ball games and our performances, that they were there to help with homework and to be a shoulder to lean on when we were sad, that they listened to us and genuinely cared about our well-being, that they provided us with the necessities of life, and that they taught us right from wrong. Being a parent can be a grind, day in and day out, but parents show they love their children by being there every day, by trying the best that they can. Now, there are those who won't do all that, and instead will just show up on Christmas and birthdays and maybe some other days in between with great elaborate gifts. But no matter how impressive the gifts may be, they can never take the place of being there for your children every day. That's what love is. A new car on your 16th birthday is an impressive gift, but it's not near as impressive as answering the bell every day for those 16 years. And that's what Amos is saying to the people of Israel, that being the covenant people of God means more than just showing up to worship on the Sabbath and bringing big sacrifices on the high holy festival days. Being the covenant people of God means worshiping God with everything we do every day. For Amos, big shows of worship mean nothing when the people making those big shows then take advantage of the poor and refuse to help those who are in need. Showing up with a sacrificial lamb is an empty gesture when the rest of the time you're worrying more about your own ease and enjoyment, living the good life when others struggle to have just enough for the day. The lesson we learn from Amos is that if you want to truly love and serve God, you got to do justice, and you got to do it every day. Now, when I read this, I can't help but think of the current situation on our borders, or of those who work for a minimum wage that goes unchanged even though the cost of living keeps going up. I can't help but think of those who are hired as full-time employees for less than what's legally considered full-time hours so that employers can avoid providing mandated benefits. When I read Amos' call for justice, I can't help but think of my own shopping around looking for bargains and low prices, when often those bargains are provided on the backs of sweatshop laborers, or at the very least, provided on the backs of those who work long hours for little money with precious few other options. When I read Amos, I think of the ways we exploit or allow the exploitation of the poor and the needy for the sake of cheaper goods and better lives for ourselves. Yes, we do a lot of good. We do. And we've achieved a lot of justice. But if we're able to take an honest look around, we'll see that we've still got a lot of work left to do. Now, I'm sorry if this sounds like a bit of a downer lesson today, and I know that there are maybe even a few of you that feel like we're talking a lot about too much what sounds like politics and partisan politics at that. So I'd encourage you all to read the whole book of Amos. It's only 9 chapters. You can knock it out in about 20 minutes. Read the whole thing and then tell me what you think. And remember, Amos doesn't say watch and see if justice will be done by the system. Amos says to let justice roll down like waters. Let there be so much of it that it's like a river, unstoppable, overwhelming, loud, rushing, bringing life to all who drink from it. If you think the world is just already, if you think we're literally overwhelmed by fair play and by the needy and the poor and those on the margins being treated fairly, and truly having an equal opportunity to experience the depth and breadth of God's mercy and steadfast love, well, then that's all we can ask, isn't it? But if, like me, you think we've got a ways to go, then then let's commit ourselves to worshiping God every day with all that we do, to make ourselves servants of God's kingdom by working to see that justice is done for all of God's children. There are 168 hours in a week. God wants us to live all of them as an act of worship, remembering God, honoring God in all that we do. 1 hour of getting dressed up nice and worshiping elaborately will not make up for a life of self-centered living. To God be all glory, honor, power, and dominion in this world and in the world that is to come.